The conflict right now is really undergoing a massive escalation, and one that I think has come as a surprise to a lot of people. The kind of current phase of the Russia-Ukraine conflict began in 2014 with the Russian annexation of Crimea and then the declaration of the separatist republics in eastern Ukraine. And so the war has been ongoing for the past 8 years, but it was really in the last few months when Russia decided to send over 100,000 troops to the borders of Ukraine and began sort of escalating their rhetoric about the need for Russia to have more of a presence in Ukraine, accusing Ukraine without any basis of war crimes. That people sort of began to be very concerned that this was not just going to be business as usual, but kind of a massive escalation of a Russian intervention in Ukraine. And we saw on Monday that is what is happening, that Vladimir Putin has recognized these separatist republics in eastern Ukraine as independent, and has promised that Russia will support these republics militarily. And claims that sort of if the Ukrainian government doesn't allow these republics to be independent and be separate from the rest of Ukraine, that Russia will respond militarily. So it sounds sort of like this is really kind of a pretext for moving Russian troops beyond these separatist republics in eastern Ukraine, where they had been for a while, to kind of the rest of the country. And that's what's really alarming a lot of people.
And what does this mean for us here in the U.S.?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think for the Biden administration, they really have wanted to pursue diplomatic solutions here. They've sort of been willing to engage Russia on what kind of Russia says are its concerns about Ukraine's desire to join NATO and have a closer relationship with the West. But I think that the US government has made it very clear that if Russia does escalate, which now they have, that there will be consequences. So I think for the United States and for Americans, it's a question of what these consequences will be. I think it's pretty clear that there'll be increased sanctions, which sort of will be a way to punish Russia economically. But in terms of what this means of, is the United States going to send more weapons, more support to Ukraine? That's something that I would be watching for. And I think it's also a chance for the United States to, after sort of this withdrawal from Afghanistan, to kind of assert what does it look like for us to involve ourselves in these types of conflicts. And I think that that's kind of an open question, and it's one that's up for a lot of debate in American politics of sort of what role the United States should have in the world. And I think this conflict is going to kind of force us to have to come to grips with that.
And this is a question from my producer. How do you believe Russia used religious institutions to govern and transform new Soviet populations in West Ukraine?
Oh, so that is a question with regard to kind of my research expertise in terms of how I approach these issues. I think that one of the things that we think about a lot with Russia and Ukraine's relationship is the role of kind of Ukraine in Russian history, how Russia sees its culture and its language as being connected to the Ukrainian lands. But there's another aspect of this, and that's religion, that there are these religious ties between Russia and Ukraine in terms of the Orthodox religion that is the kind of majority religion in both countries. And in the speech that Russian President Vladimir Putin gave on Monday, he mentioned that kind of these religious ties were one of the reasons that Russia sees Ukraine as part of its heritage, whereas Ukrainians kind of see this religious connection differently. They see that, yes, there are these ties with both countries practicing Orthodoxy, but that Ukraine has its own religious tradition, its own culture, its own language, and that Russia can't claim that. And so that's kind of one of the ways to look at this conflict.
I muted myself because my cat was meowing.
Oh, that's fine.
And finally, how do you believe history reveals what the Russian president really wants to do in Ukraine?
Yeah, so I think what is interesting about this conflict is what's new about it and what's not so new. Really kind of from the time of Imperial Russia, before the Soviet Union, when Russia was an empire ruled by, an autocratic czar, there was this real interest in the Ukrainian lands as this kind of central part of the Russian Empire. And when there were efforts among people in the Ukrainian lands to assert their independence or to assert that their history was not the same as the history of Russia, that's kind of led to a lot of conflicts historically. And I think that in looking at the conflict today, Vladimir Putin looks back on this history and he sees sort of these efforts at Ukrainian independence as something that has always kind of resulted in something negative for the Ukrainian people in his view. Whereas Ukrainians look at these efforts at independence as a proud part of their history, as a part of kind of their history of fighting for their sovereignty and fighting for their culture and their language. And so in Putin's efforts to kind of recast this history, we can see how he's kind of trying to chip away at how Ukrainians see themselves and their country's place in the world.
Right, that's everything I had. Is there anything else you wanted to be sure to mention on this? I know they're loaded question. It's obviously your expertise.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I would add. I think one last thing that I would add is that I think when we try to think about, how this conflict might end or how things might play out in the future, I always try to remain optimistic about things. But I think what's really telling is that when Putin gave this speech on Monday, where he recognized the independence of these republics and announced that Russia was going to be sending its military in, he made this announcement after giving a speech where he claimed that Ukraine didn't really have a right to exist as a country. And so I think what is alarming about that is that it might indicate that his plans actually extend beyond this kind of separatist region, and that his plans really are for kind of dismantling Ukraine as we know it. And it's very alarming to think about what that might look like.
Well, thank you so much for taking time to speak with us. I know I certainly learned a lot because, like I said, I've been kind of removed from all of this. So I appreciate you kind of filling me in and obviously our viewers. So
yeah, no problem. I mean, it's one of these things it's been ongoing for a while, but it hasn't really been in the news here. We've had so many things at home that we've been focused on. So now that we have this escalation, we're kind of all grappling with it for the first time. Many Americans are. So I think a lot of us are trying to figure out what's happening.